Hi everyone. So of course I'm a day late and I just got out of the bath. I'm doing Radical Acceptance Chapter 8. This one is called Awakening Compassion for Ourselves. This is one that I personally have been working on for a long time on my personal journey. So I think it holds a special place for me because it's been something that I've struggled with. And if you've seen my other lives, I've talked about self-compassion from Kristen Neff. And I think it's one of the most difficult things to fully embrace. She has a lot of insight. It's a short chapter. It's not as long or as detailed as the last chapter. And it also gets a little bit more on the religious side. If you're reading this book as an agnostic or an atheist, just be aware that there are a lot of symbolisms and interesting kind of parallels with religion. And okay, so I'm just going to jump right in because good morning, Sean. It's nice to see you on here. So I am reviewing, just so you know, Radical Acceptance, the book by Tara Brach, and we're on chapter 8. So if it doesn't make sense to you, so be it. But there are a lot I'm sure you can, because this is about self-compassion. So basically, she starts this chapter by talking about the very common practice that all of us do, which is by distancing ourselves from emotional pain. We often cover over it with self-judgment, and this results on us just being our harshest critic or hardest on ourselves. And she talked a little bit about this in chapter 1 when she talks about the trance of unworthiness, right? That we get into this idea of this cycle of being really hard on ourselves. And really, in this chapter, she's going to go deeper into why we have to overcome that, which is a beautiful thing if you can do it. So my notes, I promise, are not copious for this one, so it won't be a super long live. One thing she said that I really loved was, when we push parts of ourselves away, we only dig deeper into that trance of unworthiness. In other words, it is a coping for the neuroscience geek, it is a coping mechanism of your brain. And I talk to people about this all the time. When you start to feel emotional pain, it is easier to push it away and then judge yourself and then not deal with it compassionately. Just judge yourself harshly and then get into that whole big cycle we talked about, I think 2 chapters ago, that cycle of, because I'm just a terrible person, and then that just, starts this terrible cycle, which really doesn't get us anywhere. And so she reminds us in this chapter that radical acceptance is both mindfulness, which we have dealt with, and compassion. So you cannot truly have radical acceptance if you don't have both of those things. So she also makes a point to say that through compassion, you will reach healing and true connectedness. And if you don't have compassion, you can't. You literally cut yourself off from truly being healed and being able to truly connect. Not only connect with yourself, but all those around you, to, connect to that community that we talked about in the last chapter, to connect to the greater world around you. Basically, you have to develop compassion, not only for others, but also yourself. Now, she does admit here in this chapter something very interesting I found. She said, it's only through self-compassion that you can truly have compassion for others. But then she flips it and says, although for some people, it is easier to go the opposite way, right? Find true compassion for others and that can lead to a compassion for yourself. I find that really interesting, and it goes into some of the studies that I have done into neurolinguistics and kind of how the brain works and how each individual has different parts that really come out. And so I found that really interesting that she kind of says it one way and then goes back and says, but that's not true for every person, which I kind of, I love that, where it's an individual kind of thing. She says that we really need to embrace experiences that bring our attention to the pain and fear, which is no big shock there. That's something that we've been talking about throughout this, right? Buddha facing his fear head on, inviting it to tea, right? We've talked about all of this. And then she goes on and says, attention and care given to our most wounded places brings about the most radical transformation. That is pretty powerful. I'm going to say it one more time. If we can bring attention and care to our most wounded places, we will find the most radical transformation. Now, if you know me personally, and we've talked about my personal journey, you will know that is very true. I have had a lot. I'm trying not to cry. Obviously, it's very emotional for me because I feel like it's there in those moments where it's the most difficult to show compassion to yourself that you can break through the wall. And I have said to a lot of people, like, I can see the wall. I can't get through the wall. I just don't know how to get through it. And for me, self-compassion is just starting to happen now. And I've been diligently working on it for a year. So when we talk about this book, I'm sharing that with you all because this has to be public to be live, is that it can be a long road. It is absolutely worth every minute of what, of all the things you put into it. Not only the time, but the effort is worth it. But it's not one of those instantaneous things. Sometimes I feel like in this world, and when there's a book, like we feel like we can just go through this book and it's, we'll do each chapter and we'll do the, challenge at the end and then we're there. And I know I've said in the last one that don't skip these challenges, give some time to those challenges. And if you find one difficult, stick with it. So I'm doing another book for myself and I find myself I'm still I could read the book, but the steps are much harder for me to do. I'm just not there yet. And it takes time, especially if you've lived 40 years without giving yourself a lot of compassion. So I say that just for all of you to stick with it because it's truly worth it in the end. And I do think you will find the most radical transformation when you can find that compassion for yourself. And then she says, of course, this beautiful finding tenderness and openness for ourselves also leads to finding that for others. So it is truly that connection that is quite beautiful to see. Okay, so that's the first part of this chapter. Then, and she goes through some very heartbreaking stories. So if you're up for reading this chapter, just trigger warning. There's a lot in here about personal stories, about incest, about parental responsibilities. So just trigger warning for anyone who's just picking up this book. This one is a hard chapter to read. She then goes to, so I'm not going to go into all of those stories. I think they highlight things very dramatically and well, but for all intents and purposes, you can go through that on your own. The second part of this chapter, she calls reaching out. And this is interesting because this is where she talks about that. Basically, if I could boil this down, I'm looking at all my notes going, here's the thing. we all have a basic human need for compassion. Sometimes we need to be held in the compassion. And it's easiest to think about that as our own journey when we start off as a baby or a child, and we constantly need the reassurance and compassion of a loving and attached caregiver, right? Oftentimes that's the parent. That feeling of being accepted and loved unconditionally and held in compassion no matter what is a universal need. And guess what? That universal need does not leave us just because we get older. It changes in how we are held, but it doesn't go away. So, like when I talk to parents, I am constantly saying, hey, listen, here's the deal, right? Like, you have to get to a place within yourself that you're in a good spot, that you're present and mindful of your own emotions, and that before you respond to a child that is maybe behaving in not the greatest way, that you can let go of your own emotions and say to yourself, this child is having a hard time, and above all else, this child needs me to hold them in compassion. That you truly see them not for the symptoms of the bad behavior, but compassion that they're really having a hard time and they don't have the skills to handle it. If only we could have that same compassion for every person, this world would be a very different place. And if we could only have that compassion for ourselves, because we also have that need to be held. And if you're the parent, you have gone from being the person who holds this child, right? And you once were held. Now you're the holder. And sometimes we forget that we also have to be held. This is where she illustrates this with religion, which is really interesting because she actually uses a story of a Catholic woman, which is really interesting in a book that's supposed to be based on Buddhism, right? That she's using another religion to exemplify this. The beauty of this is basically what you see when you look at people who are really struggling and need compassion. Oftentimes, you will hear you have to accept that there's something greater than yourself and surrender or give over to it. And what's interesting here is, for me, it's the link to the need to be held. We sometimes, especially if we've been in the trance, right, of unworthiness, are almost unable to do that for ourselves. And if it's deep-rooted, I'm going to try not to cry here, actually. If it's deep-rooted, sometimes we can't offer it to ourselves, right? If you're feeling guilt and shame and all of those things, it is very difficult to come through that with compassion for yourself because you're feeling guilt and shame. And especially, there's two sides to this, is the other side of forgiveness. So sometimes your guilt and shame, you're able to say you're sorry, to make amends with someone, and it relieves you a little bit of the guilt and shame. Sometimes you're unable to, for whatever reason. You know, it could be a really awful reason, like the person is no longer there to even give your amends to. Or it could be because you yourself cannot forgive yourself for these things, right? When you're stuck in that place, it can be a very dark and lonely place to be, because that need to be held and have compassion is not there. So literally what you're doing is constantly berating yourself and putting yourself in a place where you have no compassion. No one can give you any compassion. And it feels kind of hopeless. Like you can't move on from there. And so what she's saying here is sometimes there is, even in Buddhism, that doesn't necessarily hold a universal God, they still use meditative prayer in the fact that we look to something larger than ourselves for the loving hold of compassion. And basically, the only way to heal is to let go of the self-hatred. So, I know I'm really proud of myself to getting through that without breaking down and crying. Basically, you can look at the suffering that you're going through and the pain and suffering that you're going through as a gateway to open to compassion. And oftentimes it is those that have the most suffering and the most pain that become the most compassionate. So she goes on to say that we can do this in Buddhism as well. And she talks about, there's a Buddhist meditation that says, may this suffering serve to awaken compassion. And I think that's a beautiful mantra if that's where you are and you're having trouble surrendering to your own self-compassion, but you realize that and you're mindful and aware of the actual pain and suffering that you're feeling. Because again, remember that part in the beginning she talks about is that we cover it over and we just don't deal with it. So we have to become mindful and aware of it. And if you're inviting it in and looking at it in the face, the next step is to say, may this suffering serve to awaken my compassion. So when you are able to do this, so whether it's giving over to something bigger so that you feel the compassion and then are able to encompass the compassion within yourself, which is really what the goal is, right? Is that once you are able to have that compassion, the spark that happens is that you realize that you shouldn't be faulted, right? With this burden of anger or fear or grief, which you have this guilt or shame over, because this is a universal thing. Every single living being has anger and grief and fear. And I mean, as a biologist, we talk about this all the time, like the, amazing realization that elephants were mourning, right? I remember when that paper was published and there were tons of news articles about it. These are the truths of being alive. And when we have compassion, my power is going in and out. So if I cut out, you know what it is. When this happens, we can connect again to all those around us, the universe, right? And all living things, and say, this is not a personal flaw within myself, that I'm an angry person or, right, I'm a fearful person, right? This is the truth of what it is to be alive. So by connecting that, we can realize that the suffering that we feel from this will rise and it will pass. And we move past it with compassion. It's kind of beautiful. All right. So like I said, I don't have copious notes on this. She has a couple of examples in there. And then she goes on to her guided meditations, which I will post. She has 2 in there, and I believe I found links to both of them. So I will post them on the end of this post. If you want to dig, I do not know what the next chapter is. I did not go ahead. So if you want to dig further into self-compassion, again, Kristin Neff wrote the Self-Compassion book. If this is really difficult for you, this is another one, based on the last chapter too, that I would suggest, if you don't have support, finding some support to get to a place of self-compassion. Sometimes it's not easy doing it yourself. So whether that's a doctor, a therapist, or a coach, those are all great people to reach out to dig into finding the ways to self-compassion. That's what I got for this week. So I hope you all have a fantastic holiday. If you're in the United States, we are celebrating Thanksgiving. It's a great week to profess your gratitude for things. I love that some people I know have been having a full month of gratitude. I think that's really important. It's also an easy way to get your kids into gratitude, because Thanksgiving is like, we're all giving thanks, and that's an easy in. If you can continue that down through the next month, it's even greater, because you can take the gratitude and the giving thanks and then put that into a season of giving yourself, and it doesn't have to be monetary. In my family, we do a calendar, and the majority of it is random acts of kindness. So I would highly encourage that. It does help your brain be happier, gratitude and giving. So in that light, I will say goodbye, and I will be back next week with the next chapter, which would be chapter 9 in Radical Acceptance. Have a great week.